Welcome to lecture number 10. We are studying probability and statistics, and we are going to finish chapter number 1. Perhaps this is the second last lecture from chapter number 1. This is we'll study skewed and symmetric plots. A dot plot is symmetric. A dot plot, we have already studied dot plot. Dot plot is plotted for quantitative data and gives us an idea about the distribution of the data underlying an underlying distribution in a given raw data. If the data is having a single peak, that data is called symmetric, and the distribution is such that there is a single peak, and around that peak there are almost equal heights or equal stuff on both sides of that peak. So the thing that is on the left side of this peak is almost the same as it is on the right side. These types of graphs, we call them the symmetric plots. It's a symmetric plot, one peak and the left and the data to the left of that peak is almost identical to the data present on the right side of the peak. That is why we call it symmetric. Symmetric means similar. So there is one peak, the left side is similar to that of the right side or vice versa. So that is why we call it symmetric. A dot plot, on the other hand, the long left tail is called skewed. There can be two types of skews. It can be either skewed to the left if we have a peak on the left side of the data and the right side, and there's only one peak and that is to the left. So this means the data isn't symmetric, but it is skewed. It is biased towards left. So if it has a long tail, but the tail is on the left side, that is why we call it skewed to the left. A converse of that or an opposite of that would be data that is skewed to the right. That is a long right tail. So these type of data we draw the dot plot and we identify that there is a long right peak. This means that the data is skewed to the right, right? Right. Right. So skews, the data can be skewed either to the left or to the right, and the other type of plot is symmetric, where there is only one peak and the data to the left is almost identical to the data on the right side of the peak. But that is not the case in the case of if we have skew to the left or skew to the right data. And one of the things that we'll study in this lecture is outliers. Data points that are usually larger or smaller, or that are they are unusually larger or smaller than other data points are outliers. Outliers means very far away from the rest of the data, from the remaining data. What's that and why are there? Why do we have outliers? These usually indicate a mistake in making measurements in a given data. For example, there is a clerk in your department who is compiling the CGPAs of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 students. So the clerk is compiling CGPAs of 8 students and he makes a mistake. He's in a hurry and he writes the CGPA of the first one correctly, the second is okay, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and 2. When he reaches to the last student, instead of writing 2.1, he puts this decimal point to the wrong place before 2. It should be after 2. So he makes a mistake, I put it here at the wrong place. So it becomes 0.21. So this is actually a mistake. This is due to a mistake made by the clerk. So how would you identify it? If you plot this data on a dot plot, we see all the data points, they are very close to each other, but this data point is very far away from the rest of the data, from this data. This is very far away. So this indicates that it is an outlier. Right. So outliers are generally very far away. They can either be very small, unusually small, or they can be unusually large compared to the rest of the data. So that indicates a mistake. So we can use this dot plot to figure out there is a mistake, or to check whether there is a mistake in the compilation of the data of CGPAs of our students. So that can be used as a tool to identify any mistakes made in the records. Right. So the last thing for this lecture is unimodal distribution and bimodal. There are there can be two different types of distributions. We have already studied that histograms or relative histograms, they give us an idea of the distribution of data. How many are the points between these two limits? How many are between these two limits? So we identify, in last lecture we studied that we identify some limits, bin limits, the upper limit and the lower limits of bins, and then we put data points in the limits, and the height of that bin, height of each bin is proportional to the data points that are accommodated in that bin. So if the nature of the data is such that there is only one long peak, one very high peak in the data, and the rest of the bins are not that high, this means there is only one peak in the data. Such kind of distributions, we call them unimodal distribution. Uni means one, model means peak. So there is only one peak in your data. We plot and we see only one large bin, and all the remaining bins aren't that large. We call it unimodal. Model means peak, uni means one. So there is only one peak. But in contrary to that, there can be a data where we have two peaks. Instead of having one peak, we have two bins of almost equal height, and the remaining bins, they are of smaller heights. So such kind of data, it can be like this. We can have bins like this, but there are two peaks. So we call this data as bimodal. So unimodal histograms say, in many histograms, we see unimodal distribution or bimodal distribution. If we have one peak, it's unimodal. If we have two peaks, it's bimodal. Right, that's all for this lecture. And with this lecture, we have almost concluded chapter number 1 of the book, except in the last lecture, maybe in P&S11 lecture, the next lecture to come, we will draw some dot plots and frequency histograms using Minitab. That will be an exercise, or that will be some laboratory work or some practical work of what we have studied. But with this lecture, P&S10, we have studied all, or we have completed all the theory described about different types of plots in chapter number 1. So after P&S11, the next lecture, from P&S12, we will start chapter number 2. Thank you.